from wherever you happen to be. It's the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. And now, here's your host, curator of the Hall, Jamie Dew.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Doug. It is great to be here hosting the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. If this is your first visit to the Hall, welcome. And for goodness sake, wipe your feet at the door. This is a hallowed institution. The premise is simple. There are a lot of performers that have stood on the stage at Studio 8H, and there are a lot of writers who have been featured behind the scenes. There are several of these players that you would call all-stars that are absolutely key at their positions and have made a indelible mark on Saturday Night Live history. And that's really cool. Those are the people we are going to celebrate and elevate by electing a certain cohort of them to the SNL Hall of Fame. Here's how it's going to work. Each week, I am going to be joined by a guest or several guests who will bring to the table a nominee. And at the end of the season, when we have all our nominees, we will open the doors, open the windows. We'll open every orifice we can open to allow you to vote, to exercise your franchise and vote. And if your favorite player ends up with more than 50, appearing on more than 51% of the ballots, they will be elected into the Hall of Fame. If you have any questions about the nitty-gritty, please send me an email, jamie@snlhof.com, or reach out on Twitter @SNLHOF. We even have a Facebook group, and you can sign up in there and play around as well. So there's lots of interesting places to find us and what we're doing and how we're doing it, including the SNLHOF website, which you can find at snlhof.com. We've got everything you can imagine listed there, including guest information, episode information, and whatnot. So a valuable resource, along with, all the other podcasts out there. We are really thrilled to be joining a robust SNL community at this point. I can't speak highly enough of the quality content that is, going out week over week. You should definitely check out the SNL podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. There is a tremendous amount of information available. And it's a wonderful time to be an SNL fan. So there's that. I can tell you that this week's episode is sort of different. There's only going to be one guest and one nominee on this episode because it's the guest, or rather the nominee. The guest, Andrew Clarke, is fantastic. He is a multi-hyphonate. He's a writer. He's an educator. He's a historian, all of comedy. And so I reached out to him to see if he would consider nominating really who should be nominated first and maybe placed in the Hall first. And that is the executive producer and creator of Saturday Night Live, Mr. Lorne Michaels. It's a fascinating discussion that I have with Mr. Clarke, and I invite you to listen in on that interview now.
there's no Lorne Michaels, there's no Saturday Night Live. So I think it all stems from there, you know? Yeah.
We're done here. That's it.
Sounds good. All right.
Andrew, what's your history with Saturday Night Live?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, like it debuted when I was around 9 or 10. When I was old enough to stay up and watch it, I was watching it, and was particularly influenced, say, by Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi. When John Belushi sadly died, my friends and I had a toga party wake in his honor, and for which I got in trouble. I forgot to take the safety pins out of the sheets in my house, and therefore my parents caught me. But we were really, really into the Saturday Night Live aesthetic, and particularly those guys. And then it just kept going. And if you're interested in comedy or a comedy fan, you're always keeping an eye on Saturday Night Live. You may not watch it all the time, but you certainly keep an eye on it. And now with people being able to record it, watch it any time, I mean, their audience is probably, continuing to expand.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it seems that it really is people of all ages watching at this point. So for more than 40 years, it's been a fixture of late night television.
Yeah. And I also think like Lorne Michaels, he's a sports fan. I mean, he's certainly a baseball fan. And so I think he really saw the show when he came back to it as a franchise, in the same way that the coach of the team doesn't have the same players every year, that Saturday Night Live was going to kind of rejuvenate itself every year, and in fact, probably turn over entirely every 5 years or so. And that has turned out to be the show's single greatest engine, I think. And he's been a very, very good judge of comedy talent. And he's had some really great people scouting for him too, right? It's not I think he would tell you it's not just a Lorne Michaels enterprise. Like, it's a very big tent with lots of people working underneath it. But, when you look at his ability to transcend the comedy that he started out doing as a younger man and sort of keep up, that's pretty remarkable. A lot of people don't do that. They can't really go generation after generation because they get a bit too hung up on understanding it. I remember interviewing Lorne Michaels in 95, I think it was, or 96, for the first time. And he was just talking about some new cast members, among them Adam Sandler was at the time, I think David Spade, Chris Rock. And he said, I'm getting a lot of heat in some respects because people are not getting these guys, especially the older executives and stuff at the network. But he said, and I don't entirely get it, but I know it's funny. And that always kind of struck me, the ability to say, even though I may not completely get this, I still can know and sense that it's funny. And then that allows you to keep going and sort of where we are now, which is their debuted, I think it was in 75. So, we're going to get pretty close to the 50th anniversary pretty soon.
Yeah, this is season 46 right now.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, so they've been doing it for a while. He's quite the tastemaker. So going back to your initial statement, there is no Saturday Night Live without Lorne Michaels. I think, if you look through his history, you almost see a breadcrumb trail form. Was he destined to do a show like this?
Well, you could argue maybe. I mean, if you look at his upbringing, he's a Toronto kid. He grows up going to CNE and doing all those sorts of things. Unfortunately, his father, I think, passes away when he's around 14. And a few years later, he starts dating Rosie Schuster, who's the daughter of Frank Schuster, right? And so Frank, in some ways, becomes a bit of an extra parental figure or father figure. I'm not saying a replacement or anything like that, but a kind of male role model that Lorne Michaels kind of grows up talking to about comedy and studying. And at the same time, he's enjoying all the 60s counterculture. He goes through U of T, where he meets Hart Pomerantz, and so they start doing comedy. And you've got Hart and Lorne, and he spends some time in England where he gets to know the Pythons, and he's going to spend time in Los Angeles doing TV and all of that kind of stuff. So he's sort of got a hybrid of British humor, American humor, and that kind of weirdly fatalistic Canadian sensibility. And I think the other thing is he had a great sense of how to bridge the different aspects that can go into commercial TV production. So he could be completely in sync with, say, the not ready for primetime players, whose whole idea was they hated television, and also in sync with the Suits on the top floor. I think Rockefeller Center is 34 floors, and his office, I think, at one time was on the 17th, which I always thought was a little symbolic because it's like you're right in between. So he was able to keep the show going. Shows like the Smothers Brothers eventually kind of imploded because they couldn't navigate that. Now, whether they should have, I'm not arguing that, but they were very counterculture. They were against Vietnam and pretty, out there and strident about it. And eventually they were pulled off the air. I mean, Saturday Night Live has had its share of controversies. There was one recently, but it's sort of always able to navigate those. And I think a big part of that is Lorne Michaels has that really great knack. And also that combination of British, American, and Canadian sensibilities, which nowadays I don't think is as important, because I don't think the British influence in Canada is anywhere near what it was, say, in the 60s or the 70s. But at that time, it was a big part of, what was happening in terms of culture in Canada. You got stuff from England much sooner than anyone in the United States, generally speaking.
Interesting. I never really put the third side to that triumvirate with the British piece. I knew he was a giant Pythons fan, but I didn't realize that he had spent time there.
Oh yeah, he spent time living in Shepherd's Bush, and he would go and watch the Pythons and watch them, I think, filming the show. And when you see the first seasons of Saturday Night Live, you see, there's animation, there's Land Shark, things like that that kind of absurd. And even the idea of ending a sketch without ending a sketch. Those are all things you could kind of see the Pythons doing and then him kind of picking up on. I mean, the show is very original, but it is also an interesting example of the baby boomer generation, which is the first generation to grow up in front of the electronic babysitter, as Dave Thomas called the television once when I was talking to him. And so a lot of what they're doing is a reaction against television and its kind of authority and power.
Right.
So commercial parodies, making fun of the news, all of those sorts of things are part of that. And I also think doing political humor, which Lorne Michaels was told was suicidal. Like, no one wants it. Don't do it. He kind of stuck to his guns. We have a long history of political kind of humor in Canada and in Britain too. And there's a rich, rich history in America of political humor. But at the time, you didn't find much of it on network television. You had to look elsewhere. And he sort of, I think, championed that. And again, so the show is somewhat of a tribute to live television, the golden age, all of that kind of stuff, howdy doody. And at the same time, it's a complete rejection of it. So it's a neat hybrid, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, completely. And it's a hybrid that couldn't have come, at a different time. Like, I really don't think, like, comedy was going through this, this disillusionment, this renaissance. Like, you had Lampoon doing biting satire and a lot of really cool things there. And then Lorne comes along and, sort of from the pages of Lampoon and that ethic, creates SNL. He's got to go in the hall, right?
I would say he should win and he should be elected. That's kind of like saying, no, I can't I'm going to make some religious analogy that's going to offend lots and lots of people, so I won't do that. But I would say that, without Lorne Michaels, there is no Saturday Night Live. And, I think that it's, whenever you do something like this, there's always an element of winking or an asterisk. And by that, I mean, you can never say definitively who is the absolute, obviously, right? And in fact, we all have our favorite cast, right? And it tends to be the cast that you watched between age 14 and 17 or 14 and 16, you're old enough to stay up, but not really old enough to be allowed to go out. And so you're home watching Saturday Night Live. Now that's changed a little bit because people can watch it online and all sorts of other things. But I think people always have their favorite cast members, their favorite seasons. I think the quality has generally always been pretty great. I mean, people always, I mean, they ran the headline Saturday Night Live or Saturday Night Dead, I think the year after it started. So they were already calling for its demise in like 1976.
Wow.
And, they're still waiting. No, I mean, it wasn't, some people hated it. And then, the years where Lorne Michaels wasn't there, they had talented cast members, but I just think that the people in charge didn't understand the show.
Right.
I mean, you had Eddie Murphy, who went on to become a star. You had Robin Duke. You had, a lot of great people. And, if you talk to them, like Robin teaches at Humber, she'll say, oh, yeah, when we were on the show, people, they didn't like us, some of them. We'd have people on the street saying, hey, you've wrecked Saturday Night Live. And, it's crazy, right? People take it way too personally. I think the other thing that people have to remember is that comedy is not a sure thing. And by that, I mean, if Saturday Night Live never had a sketch that didn't work, then they'd never have a really great sketch. You kind of always have to wonder, if you're not worried about going too far, you probably haven't gotten far enough. And by that, I don't mean offending people just for the sake of it, which is kind of dull. But I mean, when you're in that zone and you think you want to make a point, you go for it, being willing to suffer the consequences of it. And I think that that's an important element of the show. And then again, if you look at the head writers, people are like Jim Downey. I mean, he and Norm Macdonald were fired from the show for doing those O.J. Simpson's bits. And I remember we had Jim come up to Humber and him sort of saying, yeah, we just couldn't stop. And, they kept waiting for Lorne to really lower the boom, but he just kind of let them go. And then eventually they got fired, and that was it, but he sort of said it was like a compulsion. Like they knew they should stop, but they couldn't stop. It was just too big of a thing. Anyway, those kinds of stories, I think, are why people, in some respects, really love the show. And probably to a degree that if you see people, there are a lot of people who have animosity towards the show. I think it just shows it's relevant. If everybody loves you and nobody hates you, you're probably doing something wrong as well.
That's fair. How important do you think it is that he got to not only birth the show, but then come back and, have a second run?
I think it was critical. I think the show would have gone under if he hadn't. I think that the other thing that happened with him when I've interviewed him is he sort of talked about going through a period where he felt like what he was doing wasn't, I don't know how to put the right word, credible enough. That if you were a serious fill in the blank, then you would be doing feature films or you would be doing X, Y, or Z. And so the idea of doing sketch comedy and this kind of stuff, it's the proverbial not being able to sit at the grown-ups table. And I think, as he described it to me, there was a process of him going, no, wait a minute, this is actually what I'm really enjoyed doing, what I'm good at, and it's got a lot of value. And so I think that that's been instrumental in him staying with the show as long as he has, I think. Because it's not an easy process, and I'm sure it's not perfect. I've never had the chance, obviously, to work on the show, but having observed it and interviewed a lot of people over the years, it's not an easy environment, but it produces some really great stuff. And if you look at the way it's molded the American, Canadian, and I would say in a lot of respects, the global sense of humor, it's astounding. There really isn't as many comedy institutions that have done that. SCTV took a different approach. They didn't become a franchise. They were SCTV. Martin Short joined, Robin Duke joined, Harold Ramis left, but basically that was it. That cohort, and then it's done. And they went on to do all sorts of other really great stuff. So, they had an enormous impact. I mean, it cannot be overstated. But over time, I think Saturday Night Live has had the larger one because of the sheer volume of the talent that is.
Yeah, when you look at that list of people who have, been in and out of that machine, it's astounding. You mentioned earlier about the sports franchise, sort of analogy. And I wonder then that makes Lorne Michaels, sort of the owner or the GM assembling the people to, I guess, disseminate the taste making among many different people. How has he managed to do that all these years?
Well, I think that, it's funny when I've interviewed him, he's always left me with something that I remembered. I remember him saying, you can ask for anything in the world except to be appreciated. And he also said, never do business with someone you wouldn't have lunch with. Stuff like that, which I've often remembered over time. But, I think he hires the people he really believes in, and then he trusts them. And he also has, I am pretty sure he still has the final say. So it's still about, did you make Lorne laugh? And then you have a really good chance of it getting on the show. I think one of the things that's kind of neat about Saturday Night Live is that say MacGruber, which is probably my favorite film of all time, was this crazy sketch that nobody really wanted to put on, and something got cut, so it finally got a shot. So a show like Saturday Night Live is a place where an idea like that can sort of keep going around the track or the conveyor belt until maybe the time is right, where other shows that might not happen. So I think that's how he does it. He trusts his instincts. He's smart, and he also has final say. And I think he has a pretty good, some of the directions he's given people, I think are really telling. Like telling people, you don't always try so hard, for instance, in comedy. And just kind of interesting little bits and pieces that you hear the people who've gone through there citing as they move forward, and it's interesting. They should have a book of like Lornisms or something. Put it out.
That'd be great. Well, maybe we'll sell it in the SNL Hall of Fame gift shop. Who knows? To wrap it all up, I mean, you've really done a great job of outlining, how he got here and, what he's managed to create, and the fact that it wouldn't be there were it not for him. So I just wonder if there's any sort of tags that you want to add on to your argument for why Lorne Michaels belongs in the SNL Hall of Fame.
Well, I think he's also funny. I mean, he might beg to differ, but I think he did a good job in Hart and Lorne. I know that I think he gets maybe a little bit, cringy when he sees that stuff. But I think he has a very dry sense of humor. He's a pretty funny guy, and I think that's the other thing. I mean, just again, this isn't necessarily from the interviews I had, because normally when you're sitting down with someone, like, you're having a fairly serious interview, but Lorne, Will Forte talking about filming the scene in MacGruber where he's naked humping the air, and Lorne Michaels like kind of having him do it over and over because he was laughing so hard. So I guess what I would say is there's the lesson there for people who are starting out in comedy is if you can keep that, I'll call it childlike delight in laughing, that'll probably help your career a lot. Like to have been around that long and to have seen so much comedy and still get a kick out of something so ridiculous, I think it just shows an openness to comedy, which I think is pretty great. I think some people have misunderstood maybe Lorne Michaels a little because he is Canadian, and I don't like to generalize too much, but maybe Canadians, at least back in the 60s and 70s, weren't quite as brash, perhaps. So people would misunderstand a measured kind of demeanor or reply as being a little bit kind of cool, when in fact it's just kind of a Canadian affectation, right? So people think you're really nice and polite, and really what you're doing is storing up all your bile and venom and getting ready to unleash it later, which is a very Canadian trait, right? Yes. And I think that for all of those things, he's been integral. He's a tricky one to nail down because he's not a comedian. You can't say, okay, Mike Myers, okay, he's a genius, and his Peter Sellers is an obvious antecedent, right? Like, you can see it. Lorne Michaels, it's not quite as easy because he's an impresario and a very influential producer. And, he had like, again, I remember the kids in the hall talking, I think it was with Kevin or Bruce. They wanted, when they did Brain Candy, they had a great director do it and one that they'd work with a lot. But Lorne had really suggested George Roy Hill, who had done, The Sting, Butch Cassidy, and who had a real knack for capturing kind of male rebellious energy. And you kind of wonder, I wonder. It doesn't mean that director did a bad job. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying under that tutelage, how would the movie have appeared? It's an interesting, and so it's that kind of ability, I guess, almost like a chemist to say, what are the ingredients I have, if you will, or you can call it a chef, whatever you like. What are the chemicals I have, and how do I put these together in the right proportions at the right time to create something really special? He has repeatedly been able to do that, and there are not a lot of folks out there who can claim that. So that's why I would say he should. It is the Lorne Michaels Saturday Night Live Hall of Fame. If you ask me.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Andrew. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, if they do want to, then there's perhaps something a little wrong. But yeah, I have a website, andrewclarke.ca, and I have a regular column in the Globe and Mail every week about driving. I write a humor column about driving called The Road Sage, and I'm the coordinator of the comedy writing performance program at Humber College. So it's a great job because I get to see lots of comedians develop, and people like Vance Banzo, Tim Blair, who are on Tall Boys, and there's a lot of people out there from Humber doing really great stuff. So it's a fun gig. So if you're deluded enough to want to be in comedy and you come to Humber, then you'll definitely get to know way more about me than you would ever have hoped or dreamed.
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks for taking some time this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Been fun.
Thanks a lot. Wasn't that great? Yeah. That was Andrew Clarke making his case for adding Lorne Michaels to the ballot. And that is now the case. Lorne Michaels is officially on the ballot for the first class of the SNL Hall of Fame. I went to the Humber School of Comedy. It was a long time ago, so all the jokes we wrote were in black and white. Oh boy. I have to live with me. So there's that. Next week, we will be back with 2 new guests nominating 2 new candidates to the ballot of the SNL Hall of Fame. And from there, you'll just have to wait and see how the season unfurls and how and who will make it to the SNL Hall of Fame. If you want to discuss this, again, I am on Twitter, I am on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. I get around. I'm social. So there's that. That's what I've got for you. And I hope you enjoyed yourself and your visit to the hall. Please turn out the lights behind you. The Saturday Night Live Hall of Fame is now closed.
Thanks for listening to the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. You can find everything you need to know about the show at snlhof.com. Don't forget to subscribe, share, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcast. This is Doug Denant saying, this is Doug Denant saying, see you next month in the hall.
Hoorah!
podcasts and such.